Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Des Moines Arts Center. I'm Jeff Fleming. I'm director of the Arts Center, and welcome to the 32nd Fingerman Lecture. First, I would like to thank Lou and Lois Fingerman for their generosity that has made this series possible. Lou passed away in June of this year after a long illness, and this afternoon's lecture and all future lectures serve to honor and acknowledge his memory and contributions to the well-being of this museum and for this community. So thank you, Lou and Lois. Today is my great pleasure to welcome the artist, Lari Pittman. He is now Emeritus Distinguished Professor of Painting and Drawing at UCLA's School of the Arts and Architecture in Los Angeles. And lives to tell the tale. In 1996, Pittman's work was the subject of a major career survey at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. The Hammer Museum in Los Angeles organized a solo retrospective in 2019. His work has also been included in major international exhibitions, such as the Whitney Biennial in 1993, 1995, 1997, and Documenta in 1997, and the Venice Biennale in 2003. His work is found in major museum collections, such as the Art Institute of Chicago, the Broad, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, Museum of Modern Art, National Gallery of Art Washington, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Hammer Museum, the Whitney Museum, and now the Des Moines Arts Center. So this afternoon, Lari and I will share a conversation for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions from you. So welcome, Lari. It's great to have you. It's been about 30 years since we've actually seen each other until this weekend. So it's so great to see you again.
Likewise.
He hasn't changed a bit, by the way. There has been so much written about your artwork, and there's so much to unpack in your practice. At first glance, your paintings are humorous, impeccably crafted, often draw from familiar imagery. But a closer inspection reveals a very complex enterprise involving the decorative, gendered spaces, violence, democracy or the lack of it, and the idea of queering as a verb. But before we delve into some of those, let's start with your personal history. You lived for a time as a child in Colombia. You received your MFA from Cal Arts with its feminist and conceptual framework. And you have since spent most of your career in Los Angeles. Can you share how you think these personal experience has informed your practice?
Well, first of all, thank you for coming, and I'm really, really excited to be here. And I've been welcomed so warmly, and I'm really happy to be part of the collection here, and I hope you have a chance to take a look at the painting. I was really happy to see it. I haven't seen it since it was made, and it's in impeccable condition, so I was relieved. Because many times what happens when you don't see a painting for such a long time, what it reminds you of is the housekeeping nature of museums or personal collections, or the lack of housekeeping. But anyway, I think regarding the personal narrative, I think the most profound, aspect of my personal narrative is my biculturalism, but more specifically rooted in language. I spoke to my mother in Spanish, which was my home language, and to my father in English. And my father became an avid, rabid Latinophile, and immersed himself in South American culture, and spoke to my mother in Spanish. So I traced the kind of awakening as an artist, or the radicalization of the self, really first through language and not through imagery per se. And I learned very quickly, as I still hold on to in my daily practice in my studio, that language always comes first, and not imagery. So I think the profound, I don't know, the kind of accuracy that it's language that produces imagery, but also imagery produces language afterwards. But for me, the inception of imagery is always through language. So that was, I think, as I look back on it, the most profound aspect of my personal narrative. I think the second most profound aspect of my personal narrative is that, unfortunately, and this is not about residual trauma, but it's actually a shameful period of my personal narrative, is that I was a victim in my 30s of gun violence. But I'm here, and so I tell people to get over it. But obviously, nothing has resolved itself in American culture on that level. I'm one of the lucky ones who is still alive and was able to prosper and to continuing making work. But that, I think, that's single event. Further, I think, was a tectonic shift in my philosophical view, my political views, and an outlook of actual incredible positivity about the future and possibilities of the future as well.
Let's talk a little bit more about the transcultural experience, which obviously is layered and has multiple dualities. Paolo Colombo has even said that your work responds to the syntax of Spanish, and that there has been discussion that your Catholic upbringing via your mother's Latina heritage fostered the decorative in your work, but that was balanced by your father's perhaps more puritanical background that deemed the decorative as feminine. How do you think about that?
I know Paolo Colombo very well, but he's a little wrong. My mother was not a practicing Catholic. I think she was what one calls a social Catholic. So, and my father was born a Presbyterian, but was a Rooseveltian socialist and a profound and staunch atheist, as I am as well. But I think that both of those residual backgrounds and all of our backgrounds still have a hold on us, whether we entertain them in terms of belief system or they're just part of one's enculturation, you know. They seep in. I think to look at Latino culture as being the precursor or the impetus for decorative impulses, I don't know, that's a bit of a type of cultural essentialization that I shy away from. And in many cases it's just as a kind of a generic way of looking at cultural complexity. I would say it's more rooted, again, as I was saying earlier, to language. For example, I did have this conversation once with Paolo Colombo. I think when you're speaking in English, English will only tolerate certain levels of leaps of logic or hyperbolic language or overtly poetic language before it starts feeling somewhat culturally suspect or can make people somewhat uneasy. But those registers in Spanish are much higher. So in daily conversation, you can hyperbolize much more, or you can reach for poetic metaphors without making people cringe. So there's a higher level register of expressions that are daily and tolerated, and that could be linked to Catholicism on some certain level. In English, I think, which is fundamentally English and American culture, its roots are so deeply Calvinist, you know, that type of hyperbole is really shied upon and seen with a bit of discomfort, you know. So I think it's rooted, again, going back less to Catholicism, but more towards the Spanish or Romance languages. For example, if some of you speak French or Italian, you actually use the pluperfect and the future subjunctive and so forth a lot more than one does in just regular conversation in English. So again, I think it's rooted in language, the difference between the registers that are available of personal expression in Spanish as those two in English. English, of course, is a fabulous technical language, you know.
You have been described as exemplifying LA art. For example, you were included in the major exhibition Helter Skelter at LA MoCA in 1992. How do you feel about that label?
I wear it proudly.
Is it true?
In other words, we were talking earlier, Jeff, about the only way to kind of form some sort of cultural movement or cultural impetus or growth in any community is the community has to feel ownership of that cultural impetus. And in many cases, that actually starts among artists, almost exclusively. And I think Los Angeles has a critical mass of artists. And I mean, I always say, I know this is a spin, culture only trickles up and money seldom trickles down. And so I think that the growth of Los Angeles is all of us in our community and my peer group and endless replacement generations. In fact, I was so happy to meet my colleague Tamika Norris here, who's in the front seat, who we worked together when she was an undergraduate at UCLA, and now she's a tenure professor at the University of Iowa. So you've got to continue that legacy here, Tamika. But yeah, I think it has to be from the ground up, and then you also create that partnership with people who have a certain amount of privilege, and you all chip in, to create. And it's obvious that that's what's happened here. I think Los Angeles, what made it and continues to make it very powerful, is that it has a critical mass of artists, and it also has a density of some of the top art schools in America. So I think it's really important that way.
In your imagery, everything is fragmented. Everything happens simultaneously, such as joy and sadness, horror and humor, violence and kindness, male and female. Connie Butler, who's the curator of your recent retrospective at the Hammer, has stated that you make history paintings for the now. And you have said that your work is a record of the world we live in today as what it feels like, smells like, and sounds like. I really like the idea of you making history paintings. Do you agree with that description?
Yes. I hope I try to do that. By nature, I'm a voyeur, and I think that the social asset for me personally of being queer is that I'm slightly outside, at least in my generation, we were. So I had an incredible vantage point, a type of, not subjectivity, but a strange mixture of subjectivity and objectivity. It seems the way that the way autism is being discussed more and more that we know about it is that there happens to be this incredibly rich, articulate world that is constantly viewing but not reciprocating. not that I'm not autistic and I'm not on the spectrum, but I always like that comparison in a way, and I think that I've been just simply a citizen observer, really. And maybe that could be, one of the basic prerequisites of maybe history painting, is just that I don't chronicle war like Delacroix or Goya chronicling the royal family. But I've tried to chronicle in a very, I don't know, maybe emotional way, or a very specific way that kind of temperature or registers of American culture. And in that sense, I'm not outside of it. I really don't think artists have any special insight. I think the only difference between myself and people who are not artists is that I've simply devoted my life on that articulation of that response within a particular medium. Whereas most humans really don't make art, contrary to Instagram and TikTok, But it's just, I think the difference is that I've devoted myself to acting on that impulse of interpretation.
Let's talk a little bit more about violence. You have stated that aesthetics for me, I use to push the wall of violence away from me. And of course, you spoke of your own personal experience with violence, both individually with you in your home, as well as violence against you as a gay man. But can you share how violence informs your work? Is it a response to it, or an escape from it, or creating a safe space for yourself?
Well, I think certainly one of the collateral damages that we are fully experiencing as Americans, regardless of your political background or class structure or whatever, is what psychologists are calling empathy fatigue. And what it is that as a nation, we have now ingested very, very high registers of violence on a daily level. And we are not totally aware of the interior collateral damage that has caused, but we're now seeing more and more exteriorizing examples of what that violence is now done. So whether we're directly involved with violence in the United States or not, I think we are ingesting very, very high dosages of that, which is causing a profound disengagement that is known as empathy fatigue. And that doesn't always fare well for a culture, because that means you're no longer projecting into the future as avidly as we should all be doing. I would say, what was the other part, Jeff?
Safe space, creating a safe space for yourself.
A safe space, well, I guess I'm from maybe, I think there's different nomenclatures. I guess in terms of academic discourse and conceptual and intellectual discourse, I use the word queer. But in reality, the ethos of my upbringing is really more gay. And I do make that distinction. And I think that this is going to be harsh, so don't be mad at me. But I always, and I think I challenge the women in the audience as well to think about this idea that exterior public outdoor space is male space, and interior space or domestic space is female space. And then from my point of view, I would like to say then that I grew up always looking at exterior outdoor public space as, more specifically, as straight male space, and interior space being queer space, or so. There's always that stereotype: why are gay men so good at decorating? Well, hello. It's so obvious because you're articulating your safe space. Many times those type of stereotypes are rooted in some sort of forensic fact on some levels. But that's, I guess, what it is that, and then the hyper decoration or the insistence of hyper decoration of the surface of my paintings is a way of exteriorizing that safety that, as a young person, I always experienced at home, and then making it public on the surface of the paintings.
Well, let's continue that dialogue. Gender and its constructions seem to underline all of your work, and you have said you have a non-binary approach. You can correct me. So let's talk about queering as a verb and how it might relate to your work. Queering in this sense, as defined by David Getze, means to queer space, creating moments of resistance, disregarding boundaries, and refusing tradition. You seem to both embrace traditional boundaries in terms of painting and the tradition of painting and disregard them at the same time. And you have also used a comparison to drag. For example, those who do it to pass and those who do it as a political statement to make room for the otherness. Can you talk about the notion of queering as a verb in your work?
I would say I'm really no different than most human beings, if they're at all honest, that most human beings in their deep interior worlds have very, very complex ideas of gender. Of course, that rarely gets exteriorized. Again, since I was, I first of all, part of it is I grew up in a very progressive family, and I was given the green light since I was a child. So I'm very, very, very lucky, and have lived in that bubble the rest of my life, and don't anyone pop it. Okay. But I guess I've never, since in my home life, those kind of binaries were never overlaid over as being a male child. I was never protocoled that way. So I think that queering came very naturally and, I don't know, very organically. I'd say the work is seen polemically, but is not intended polemically, simply because it comes out of the centrality of my natural nature. So it's not something that I've identified as an exterior issue and instrumentalized it as a vehicle within the work. I can see, in terms of intellectual discourse or academic discourse, that's how it might be discussed, as critics have done, and I think that's a legitimate way of looking at the work. It's not just looking at my work as personal expression, but looking at my work having social, or hopefully social, signification in what it's attempting to do.
I've been dying to ask you this question since we planned this. You have stated that your paintings do not reflect my personal taste. I've never heard an artist say that before.
That's absolutely true. I would never live like that. I guess what it is that comes from my educational background at CalArts. It was what I really liked about CalArts. I had gone to UCLA when I was 18 for 2 years, and I hated it. I had never gone to a public school, and it was so big, and I found it retrogressive and old-fashioned. And then I told my father that I wasn't happy, and then that there was this new school called CalArts, and I was really excited because it was the first non-bohemian, non-hippie art school in America. And it centralized the importance of popular culture in its curriculum. So I was really excited. Now, if that doesn't reveal a queerness in me, then I don't know what else. So it was just such a lure that it centralized popular culture, which was, the nomenclature of every day and available. So I was excited to go there, and I was immersed in the feminist art program, which was revisionist art history. In some ways there were, it still had its, Marxist academics on the faculty, and I found them to be somewhat punitive and in reality a bit conservative. And I was by nature more a pleasure seeker and more polymorphous. But I'm circling too much around your question.
No, that's pretty good,
but no.
Personal taste, though.
Personal taste. Okay. So what it is that.
And what is your personal taste then?
Okay. Boy, this is hard. I think it comes from, when you all think of your educational backgrounds, how that imprinted so much. So when I went to CalArts in the 70s, painting was just basura, junk. No one cared. It was dead in the water. And I guess that was also a very queer idea to think, oh, I like that it's exhausted and dead. I'm going to fix it up. And that's kind of how I approached it. So if I were to fix it up, or if one were to look at, let's say, a comparable maneuver now in late capitalism is flipping houses, that, let's say, how do you fix a house up to flip it on the market? In other words, you can't totally overlay your personal taste on it because you're most likely not going to sell it. So if it's full of Victoriana, forget it, low price. I would say, Tamika, you're laughing. I guess what it is I decided that I wasn't going to re-essentialize the practice of painting. What happens in painting is a bit insidious, that it's the one practice where the viewer essentializes the relationship between the object that is being made and who made that object. You would never penalize conceptual art or academic conceptual art with that binary. You would just simply accept that it's project-based or being influenced through multiple ideas from the outside. But in reality, I have the capacity of essentializing conceptual art as well. That's how I looked at minimalism. Minimalism is ultimately one of the most moralistic periods in American art. It's so decidedly moralistic. But painting, unfortunately, is the recipient of that type of cultural essentialism, like that the painting is the artist and the artist is the painting. And so I really rebelled against that. So I thought, in other words, how do I revive painting? And it cannot be solely based on the whims or the caprices of what one calls personal taste. Whereas I think that the look of the paintings is more related to ongoing registers of social taste. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's my personal taste.
Fantastic. Helen Molesworth, who's a marvelous curator, has written about your work in the idea of equity and democracy, that your paintings are an exploration of the difficulties inherent in democracy. And another critic has written about your work, represents a dream of Americanness that belongs to an era that never was. I mean, we see notions of democracy that is not democracy for everyone. We see that attacks on voting rights and a variety of other things happening today. So talk about the Americanness that belongs to an era that never was, inherent in your paintings or presented in your paintings.
You're weighing me down, Jeff. I mean, all powerful cultures are made of homegrown myths, lies, violence. It's nothing new, really. I could never live anywhere else. I could never live anywhere else. Maybe, I have a little house in Mexico, and I love Mexico, but it's because I speak the language really well. So that's an entree into the ethos of the culture. I guess I still believe I believe very strongly, let's say something that I do think is very American, and it's a wonderful asset, is that it's an argumentative culture. And it's a contentious culture, as opposed to being a censorious culture, although we're heading into the censorious on a quick pace, which is fascism, of course. But I still absolutely love the argumentative and contentious nature of American culture, because that means that there is also room and safety for intellectual discourse. And as much, and in a true democracy, there should be a huge range that encompasses populism and elitism. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is a distrust of one to the other, which is very dangerous. And the truly constructive, argumentative nature and the contentious nature is losing ground. And so the kind of contentiousness or aggressiveness of the paintings, the kind of cacophony, visual cacophony that's in the paintings, and the kind of prodding of you as a viewer, oh, too much. Why do you do this, Larry? It's so ungapachki, it's too much, Well, that is what American culture has always been, and so that's kind of...
It's American history painting.
It is American history painting. It is American history painting. But then again, I was never a bad boy. I'll put that out. I was always a good boy. And part of that is that, I went to school with a lot of bad boys and some amazing... I was old friends with Chris Burden, Paul McCarthy, Mike Kelly, but they were all straight bad boys. And in reality, that type of abjectness doesn't go over well with gay culture if you actually want to empower yourself. Not assimilate, but integrate yourself. So my art was never about finger pointing or showing the abject nature of American culture. That just was not the correct clothing for me as an artist. I just felt it would be counterintuitive and counterproductive, and not empowering. So even though I show that kind of high decibel level of a contentious culture in the paintings, I'm still also compelled to offer to you, to the viewer, some aspects, as you were saying earlier, of some conventional ideas of what might be considered sublime beauty as well. And that was usually done through craft and technique.
I can't help but ask you about the Art Center's painting, the Untitled in the Garden. And that comes from a series of works that deals, and it continues your conversation, the domestic space, the living room, the dining room, the bedroom, the garden. And perhaps that can be seen as the feminine space. Can you talk about our painting, the Art Center's painting?
Well, I think, again, as I was saying earlier, I think that works produce and incite, they produce polemics and incite polemical discourse, but they come out of complete cultural and personal centrality. So I am, by nature, a homemaker, and the home and the residential space is such a nexus of philosophical strength and position, and cultural strength and position. So in a way, the other thing is that maybe I don't directly deal with American trauma. I think other artists do that better. I maybe show more collateral damage of trauma, which is a little bit different. And the look of it, that could be a queering of politics as well. That's why the title of our conversation is The Look of Meaning. I know that sounds very retail, but there's something there as well. I mean, retail culture is always insisting on a yearly and seasonal basis, what does meaning look like this fall? What's the Pantone color this year? What does interior decoration say about American culture? Obviously the collateral damage on a very light level. Why did Americans all of a sudden start this craze of having plants in their house? Never before, but COVID completely, we've got to bring some plants indoors. It was really interesting to see that, especially among Gen X and Gen Y, millennials. It's like, oh my God, this is the first kind of cultural trauma we've experienced, and I've got to get a plant inside, and it's going to be my best friend, And so I look at that. That's collateral damage, and I know it's a light social observation, but then I try to look at what really does that mean? What is the, we all know the big traumas. We all know them, but what are some of the more daily, more insidious ones? The ones which are called light offenses or light intrusions, and that's a kind of attention to cultural detail that maybe historically would have been called more feminine, I guess. It's not banking or law,
You've had an extraordinary career. You've had a very long career. Was your thinking different early in your career than it is now? How has your thinking during your career, how has it changed and how has it impacted your work?
I'll try anything. I'm willing to embarrass myself with my work.
You were not early on? But you are now?
I'm ever so slightly embarrassed by the work, always, since I was young.
That's because it doesn't reflect your personal taste.
I think so. But I don't mean that in a coy way or an evasive way. This has come out of me, that kind of estrangement, I did that, but it's with a type of displacement. And I'm always a little taken aback by that, but I'm also happy that that's happened, because that means I'm not over-essentializing again the process of, I honestly don't believe in creativity either. I mean, I think that's a horrible myth. But I think if what still remains the same is I am still exceedingly excited about being an artist. I don't totally like the new version of the art world right now. But there's been many versions of that art world in my 40 years of exhibiting. So there are aspects of the 80s art world I didn't like it, and the 90s art world. But I think the kind of monetization of culture is really a difficult pill to swallow. What it is it's killing conjectural thinking, which is the title of this, conjectural thinking is actually not about recklessness, but about conjectural thinking means that by that I mean I'm still willing as an artist to project into the future. And
there's a positivity there?
Absolutely. And I remain wildly ambitious.
So that's absolutely wonderful. This is my last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. The critic David Hickey has stated, this is a long quote, but I think it's really probably one of the clearest, kindest things that can be said about your work, and I will ask you to respond to it. So Pittman's paintings do not critique things, nor are they about painting itself, or art itself, or representation itself, or history itself, or even decoration itself. In fact, if these paintings are about anything, they are about conducting oneself in an ethical way with maximum generosity and forgiveness by making art that gives and forgives as well. Thus, each of Pittman's works constitutes an instrumentality through which the artist makes his way in the world and strives to maintain a decent relationship with it. Do you like that quote?
I love it. I wish I could totally be that Larry, but I don't meddle with criticism. I mean, all along you've asked me to comment on critical writing, and I appreciate that, because actually very few people have done that, because you've quoted a lot of conjectural thinking about the work. I think I guess what it is that I'm excited that actually this was a conversation I had many, many years ago at UCLA while walking through their sculpture garden, which is also beautiful. You have a beautiful one here as well. And I was walking with Chris Burton, the performance and conceptual artist. And, we were so different. He's a bad boy artist, crazy, but very refined at the same time. And he said, Larry, the best work really has to welcome this huge range of people into it somehow. By that, I guess I internalized that. I never let go of it. And I guess a generosity occurs when, let's say, someone like Helen Molesworth, who I respect, is one of the best American critics right now, or other critics that you've named, that the work is available for that type of intellectualized, dense, critical analysis. And it's available, and they feel welcomed to go at it, for it, because of it, not liking it, whatever. On the same level then, when the UPS person comes to my studio to deliver a package, they always say, I love that painting, Larry. That's one, because I know them. And, you know, like all of us, we shopped a lot during COVID. Yeah. And so, you know, a lot of the people who help me sometimes with my stretcher bars, or I have my studio painted regularly because I like it to be very clean. You know, they always really appreciate the work, and that to me is a testament of its, I think, flexibility, and no, let's say the UPS person or the Helen Molesworths of the world never feel demeaned or excluded. So I'm really proud of that.
Okay, I lied. I do have one more question.
Okay.
We've talked about your work as history painting, as engendered spaces, as decoration, as epitomizing LA art. How would you like the viewer to engage your work?
I would think that, I mean, people ask this, like, for example, one of my pet peeves when someone comes to my studio, and I'm by nature a happy human being, but I can also get very grouchy and testy. And it usually happens when someone comes into the studio and points to something at the painting and said, what does this mean? And of course, oh my God, I go crazy. I would say when people ask how to approach the paintings, which I'm very well aware that they're very full, I would say take more time to look at it as opposed to for something. It is a painting, first of all, so it's visual. And to trust your instincts, just simply look at it and not for something. And I think maybe by jumping too quickly, I mean, I know that contemporary art causes great anxiety in the public. And I know many people who are very wealthy and very privileged who are intimidated by art. I mean, I love hearing that, actually. And I love that art still gets stolen. I love the fact that it's this thing that it's worth it enough to steal it. I love, what? You know? But that, you know, to maybe give yourself a break, it's a break for me, is I actually, we went around the galleries today, my God, you have some fabulous things here. And my first thing is just simply to look at them, not what you might think they signify. And I like what things look like. I'm not always immediately drawn to what something signifies or means. So I can actually, my favorite way of looking at art is there's a lot of artists I look at and I don't have the faintest idea what they're up to, but that doesn't deter my construction for the desire for it. You know, like the Isa Gensken in the museum, that is a stubborn, ungiving piece. And I would say, instead of seeing that as a liability, that's its asset. So then that makes me happy, and I can construct desire for it because I no longer see it as a liability. I think, no, that piece is stubborn and ungiving. That must be its asset. Oh, I like it now, you know.
Oh, I love that. Jill, I think we're ready for the questions from the audience, if there are some.
We're going to be raising the lights here, and then I have a microphone on this side, and my colleague Mia has a microphone on the other side. So as you have a question, please raise your hand, and I'll come around to you. And I'm always ready to get things started here, because I know it's a little bit, you need a little transition. I see we have a question here, but since I do have the mic, if I can get started. Larry, when I was watching some videos of you in other scenarios, I think it was an Art 21 talk, you talked about, and you started today's lecture talking about the foundation of language. And I heard you describe your works as having nouns and verbs, and I hadn't heard that before, and I'm wondering, since that's a little bit of insider information that the audience might not have heard you talk about that, could you expand a little bit upon that now, just as we're seeing some of your artwork in the background, how you think of, just furthering this discussion on art and language and nouns and verbs in your work?
Well, like for example, one of the reasons why I loved being in the classroom is then after I would conduct a class at UCLA, I would take Sunset Boulevard all the way home, and it's a beautiful winding street, and I love driving fast. But it became a ritual. I would think, well, what did I say to them? What did I say to them? You know, I would really kind of take that time. It became some sort of relaxation, or I'd call my friend Renee. But it was just, what did I say? So I would reflect on that. And many times in painting critiques, I would say, it seems that the evidence of the behavior of the painting right now is that there's an abundance of nouns, or an abundance of adjectives, but where's the transitive verb, for example, the gerund? So instead of saying it needs this or it needs, I'm not a formalist that way. So I'd say, so what is activating all these adjectives? And I can look at a painting and I can sense that its syntax is behaving in a certain way. And in many cases, what is missing is the transitive verb. Something that actually, and the transitive verb is ing, means that you're in the process of experiencing. So that's actually how I usually look at paintings today, anybody's paintings. And so that's why language is so, it's inextricably linked to the production of imagery for me, and also the behavior of imagery.
Must have been fascinating. I'm looking at your student and now the professor. To have been a student, I could walk around with Larry and hear him talk about art all day. Fantastic. I hope you'll have a question. You're thinking.
Come on, another question, or else you'll hurt my feelings.
Right here, right here.
Thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed it. There's such a
Could you do me a favor while you're asking the question?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I really enjoyed the talk. It was beautiful to hear you talk about your work, and you have such a striking use of color and pattern in the work, and I wondered if you could just elaborate on how you think about color in your work and using it.
Mm-hmm. I'm not color phobic, and I think that I like the basis of, I'll go back. One of my favorite quotes was by an old editor of Vogue, who was Diana Vreeland, and she was editor of Vogue in the 40s or 50s, maybe even into the 60s. And she spoke of the cultural relativism and taste and politics of culture in this very deft sentence. And she said, "Shocking pink is the navy blue of India." And if you parse that out, in other words, let's say in Anglo-Saxonia, this fictitious nation, navy blue speaks of a type of inherent class, culture, authority, whatever. But then you have another country that says, no, it's shocking pink. And so it speaks of the relativist, it's insisting on color as having relativist values and not absolute and culturally assigned values. Like, for example, this happens a lot in Los Angeles. It disrupts a neighborhood. It's in the papers. Someone decides to paint their house purple, you know. The neighborhood is in an uproar, you know. Well, I can understand that on some levels, but it really is about the assignation of absolute value structures to painting. And philosophically, I am a relativist. And so that means that I avail myself to color almost promiscuously that way, you know. So it really isn't, again, not about taste. It's actually it's a rebuke of cultural and social political assignations to color, you know. Or, you know, for a while when I was young, I worked in the design industry, and another line that reveals that was, where there is taupe, there's hope. You know, and that is a very powerful one as well. Isn't that good? I know. Or there's another one that I like. There's, you know, there's a color that people are painting their houses a lot in LA, which is like a really dark, almost dark grayish brown. And all of a sudden that's known as gay potato. You know? So I love those kind of cultural assignations to color that periodically pop up, and I, you know, I'm aware of that, you know. So anyway, that's my relationship to color.
I think I'm going to regret asking this question. Partly an observation from being your student and now teaching, and I'm thinking a lot about this notion of safe space, self-presentation, and the presentation of the paintings. And in a lot of the dialogues that you and I had when I was an undergrad about self-presentation, as I'm looking at the work more, I realize the expectation of the paintings looking back at me. They are almost, and I know your relationship to performance or the non-painting, but I do feel like your paintings perform. There is a level of durational or time-basedness to the work. And the queering for me comes up in the entry point, and you've talked about in the classroom, like entering through the belly button of the painting or entering through the metaphorical belly button or sometimes the actual. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, when you're asking about personal taste, for me it's more about creating safe space, potentially in personal presentation versus, in quotes, the presentation of the paintings. And I'm not sure if I'm...
Okay. I mean, it's interesting because you mentioned the word drag, and then usually, I mean, it's interesting because, you know, if we go back to Susan Sontag writing on drag and kitsch and so forth, like, for example, that's maybe where the safe space is created by, like, for example, I mean, I'm glad that I'm hearing less and less the use of the word kitsch in American culture, because kitsch, when someone says something is kitsch, what is being revealed is a kind of cultural mean-spiritedness, and it's usually a class above making fun of cultural taste of a class below. And one of my favorite quotes by Dave Hickey addresses that, which he says, "Bad taste is real taste, and good taste is the residue of someone else's privilege." So isn't that good? I know, and he wasn't even a queen. But going back to that, maybe, Tamika, is the space that I'm trying to carve out is absolutely differentiating. Like, for example, we're talking a little bit about opera. One of the things that is opera is drag to a certain degree, because you have to negotiate the simultaneity of believability and unbelievability, or many times the straddling the simultaneity of the sublime nature of the music and the kind of really unbelievable or silly libretto that happens many times. And that's what makes it difficult for a lot of people to enter opera. I think it requires the dexterity of the language of drag to enter a lot of cultural maneuvers. And that's the key, actually, to those safe spaces, is being able to entertain simultaneously belief and disbelief. And as an observer, a cultural citizen, that's actually, you can enter that space, and that's one of the safest spaces of all, you know. So it's not a physical space, it's a metaphoric space, as you said, but it's a very fine point between, like I said, I find the use of the word kitsch very problematic and mean-spirited, whereas drag is actually acknowledging, I mean, if anything, a simultaneity and polymorphousness that hopefully that's what we're trying to grapple with in American culture at this moment as well. And that would be the safe space that can eventually be created in our culture as well.
Hi, thank you very much for being here. My question is that you essentially said that you do not embrace the word creativity. And can you please explain what you think creativity means and how you don't embrace it and you don't evidently see it, or you just don't use it? I'm just wondering exactly what that meant. Thank you.
Does it sound a little hardcore? I know it sounds that way, but I guess what it is that I came of age in a moment in American culture where there was an unprecedented professionalization of the practice of being an artist, which prior to that really wasn't as strong. And with that professionalization of the identity of an artist came higher registers of deconstructive and critical language and analysis of what it meant to be and to become an artist. And I think what maybe creativity insinuates is that there's this detectable, quantifiable moment of a spark of inspiration, then is the preemptive strike for acting on an impulse. And I think those ideas are wonderfully romantic, and I love them, but I don't know really, I would say most of the professional artists that I know in the world of multiple generations don't use the word creativity or even entertain that. I think creativity also is maybe a useful term for maybe daily conduct, you know, not where maybe strict intuition and its relationship to immediate gratifying pleasure is better served, you know. But creativity and those impulses don't really serve the making of interesting work. Is it still too harsh? Okay. Thank you. No, I mean that. Thank you. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. No, I mean, I completely accept what you're saying, and it makes me happy to hear it as well. It's just that I really differentiate that intentionality and receivership are two different nations. I absolutely, like when I was talking about the critical reception of the work and the popular reception of the work, that's receivership, and they each apply their particular language and emotions and tastes to it. But that's not necessarily, like, I think my work is emotional, but I'm not in an emotional state at all when I'm making it. I'm not in, So maybe just, I appreciate what you're saying, and I don't discount it. But there's a huge difference for me, and I respect those differences between intention and receivership.
Audience, oh, good. Another question over on the other side there. Yep, thank you.
Hi, I'm over here.
Hi.
Welcome, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
You talked earlier about being wildly ambitious.
Mm-hmm.
You just also were referring to perhaps the sort of the continuing pursuit of needing and making work, of actually doing and creating the paintings. These are not small works. We're 7 and 8 feet for most of these that we're seeing here and throughout many of your previous work as well. And they're incredibly detailed and using, you mentioned earlier, skill and technique. Like, it's seemingly a huge variety of both of those things. When you say you're wildly ambitious, for what?
Sassy. I think I'm 70 now, so I'm nearing the end. And so either you poop out or you keep addressing it. So ambition is usually, whether you're young or older, very linked to mortality, more than any. So it's a philosophical inevitability and linkage. And on the other hand is a simple desire to want to make something of myself. So that's the answer.
Larry, your work is breathtaking. Your words.
Well, let's have one more question.
Oh, yes,
One
okay.
more.
One more
So
question.
now they're animating themselves and they now realize I'm not
Okay, I'm
going to
going to
bite.
pass this, or Mia's going to pass it down to Connie there in the middle.
I think you've seriously made something of yourself.
Yes, we can agree.
I think you've done it. You made a comment about minimalism being moralistic, and I didn't understand that. Can you expand on that a little bit, what that means?
The wonderful Shaker song, it is good to be simple, it is good to be pure. And in a way, I admire reductivist tendencies, but reductivist tendencies socially and culturally are always dangerous. So for example, going back to the idea of safe space on a personal level, that reductive thinking is an enemy of creating multiple complex social spaces for humans to reside. So it's not that I'm taking it out on minimalism, but I'm always interested when reductivity occurs in art, stylistically and polemically. What does that also say about elite culture that is also interested in those maneuvers? Because it's usually popular culture is not as interested in that because it feels exclusionary. But it's actually elite, highly educated culture embraces a type of reductivity, and also it actually congratulates the exclusivity of privileged taste. And so, as a queer person, I'm a bit allergic to that type of essentialization or reductivity whenever it happens in culture, and even if it happens in art as well, you know.
I am so glad that you made this visit today, and we were treated to hear you speak. Thank you for your work. Thank you for this conversation, Jeff and Larry. Everyone, if we can please give them our round of applause. you.